Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dive deep into the fascinating, complex, and honestly, deeply misunderstood world of the Arabian subcontinent right before the arrival of Islam. Now, when we hear the word Arabia today, Islam is probably the very first thing that pops into your mind, right? It's kind of like how Christianity comes to mind when we think of historical Europe. But to truly grasp world history, we've got to strip all of that away for a second and look at the absolute foundation. What was actually happening in this massive expanse of desert before the 7th century? How did people live? What did they believe? And honestly, how did they even survive?
So before we really get into it, we have to ask ourselves a pretty fundamental question. Without a massive central empire dictating the laws of the land, who actually controlled this vast desert? We are talking about an enormous, sprawling territory here, and yet there was absolutely no single king or emperor sitting on a throne.
To figure that out, we're going to break this explainer down into 5 quick steps. First, Arabia before Islam. Second, the brutal tribal society. Third, Mecca as the center of faith. Fourth, Jewish commercial dominance. And finally, the religious conflict in Medina. All right, let's jump into part 1, Arabia before Islam, a nomadic society.
You might be wondering, why didn't massive, highly structured superpowers like Rome or the Byzantine Empire ever conquer the Arabian desert? Well, it literally comes down to the fighters. On one side, you have these centralized, traditional standing armies, but facing them were the Bedouin tribes, nomadic, completely decentralized, and fiercely aggressive. They were such a wild card and so formidable that Rome didn't even bother fighting them most of the time. Instead, they'd actually recruit them as mercenaries for their own front lines.
To really understand these tribes, we have to picture their landscape, and we're not just talking about modern-day Saudi Arabia here. This territory sprawled across modern Israel, Iraq, and Kuwait. Survival in this incredibly harsh, unforgiving terrain meant constant movement. Imagine living in a world with zero state laws or constitutions. None. Instead, you followed absolutely whatever your tribal leaders dictated, ruled by these powerful, heavily armed factions like the Hanifa, the Quraysh, and the Kilab.
Moving on to part 2, the brutal tribal society, the Age of Ignorance.
This brings us to a period that the Quran later referred to as Jahiliyyah, which translates to the Age of Ignorance. And it was a profoundly patriarchal society. Women were generally viewed merely as property or burdens. In fact, during intertribal warfare, having the women of your tribe captured was considered the ultimate societal embarrassment. Tragically, this intense mindset even led to the horrifying practice of female infanticide.
To really wrap our heads around just how extreme this patriarchy was, think about the number 25. In these nomadic groups, it was completely normal for men of power and status to have up to 20 or 25 wives. It was a society entirely dominated by male authority and a raw, survival of the fittest mentality.
So how exactly do you handle conflict in a society like that? Well, the renowned French historian Maxime Rodinson really hits the nail on the head here. He notes that pre-Islamic Arabia ran solely on the power of vendetta, a theory of blood for blood. There were no courthouses in the desert, no judges. Justice meant brutal, unyielding, and absolutely immediate retaliation.
And this created a totally devastating chain of vendetta. Step 1, a single tribe member gets killed by a rival over some minor dispute. Step 2, the victim's entire tribe doesn't just go after the killer, they demand blood retribution from the rival tribe as a whole. Ultimately, this one single murder triggers a massive domino effect, escalating into a multi-generational war. We're talking about whole generations being wiped out over a single matter of tribal pride.
Which brings us to part 3, Mecca, center of faith and polytheistic worship. Way before the advent of any unified monotheistic religion, these warring tribes practiced polytheistic worship, but it was incredibly localized. Because they were entirely dependent on this brutal environment, different tribes actually worshipped different elements of nature. Some worshipped light, others rain, some the sun. They carved idols to represent these vital natural forces that literally dictated whether they lived or died in the desert.
But here is where it gets super fascinating. Despite all their endless blood feuds, they all shared one vital location, Mecca. It was the central pilgrimage hub housing the idols of all their different deities, and it was controlled by the powerful Quraysh tribe. But the absolute most crucial thing to know, Mecca served as a strictly enforced neutral zone. It was literally the one rare place where heavily armed warring tribes could safely gather, worship together, and actually negotiate truces to pause those endless vendettas.
All right, part 4, Jewish commercial dominance and the economy of Yathrib.
So if Mecca was the spiritual heart, the actual economic engine was driven by a brilliant business alliance in the city of Yathrib, which we later come to know as Medina. You had the Jewish community operating as this sophisticated business class, controlling the highly lucrative Red Sea trade routes. And on the other side, local Arab tribes like the Als and Khazraj acted as allied farmers. The tribes grew grain in the fertile lands, the Jewish traders sold it internationally, and the wealth was distributed. It was a perfectly symbiotic economy that built some incredibly strong ancient global trade networks.
But, as you can probably guess, with massive wealth comes intense rivalry. The fight to control these fertile trade routes sparked some incredibly heavy battles between the dominant Jewish traders and other powerful tribes like the Hanifa and the Tamim. Now, it is absolutely vital to note here, these conflicts were driven purely by economics. This was a war for control of land, trade routes, and resources. It wasn't a religious war at all.
And finally, Part 5, Religious Conflict in Medina and the Power Struggle.
Let's track how the demographics of this area totally shifted over time. Back in the 1st century, Jewish populations started arriving in the region, fleeing persecution from the Roman Empire. Then, by the 4th century, Christian populations began settling there too. Fast forward to the 6th century, and Jewish economic and consequently religious dominance was fully established and peaking in Yathrib. So you have these completely different worldviews colliding in a very small, very fertile area.
And that collision? It sparked the Christian-Jewish war in Medina. The Christians arrived looking to take control of this unbelievably wealthy city. Naturally, the Jewish traders fought back fiercely to protect their commercial hub. But remember that symbiotic economy we talked about earlier? Because the local Arab tribes' absolute financial survival was tied directly to that Jewish trade, they picked up their weapons and fought right alongside the Jewish community. Together, this Jewish tribal alliance successfully defeated the Christian attempt to take over, cementing Jewish commercial and religious dominance heading into the late 6th century.
Which leaves us with one massive, profound question to ponder as we wrap up today. As the 7th century dawned on Arabia, you had a deeply chaotic landscape. It was fueled by endless multi-generational tribal blood feuds, intense commercial warfare over trade routes, and localized polytheistic idol worship. So how exactly did a society that profoundly fractured and divided by blood and commerce suddenly unite under one single banner to change the course of world history forever? Well, that is the incredible story of the imminent arrival of Prophet Muhammad, and it completely rewrote the very map we just studied. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the world we see today.